Saladin had a problem that wasn't military, but political. For years he had justified his power to the Islamic world with the promise of jihad against the Crusaders, the recovery of Jerusalem as a sacred goal. But the years kept passing, and Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands. His rivals, the lords he had subdued but who did not love him, were beginning to murmur. He needed a great victory. He needed Jerusalem, or at least a victory so crushing it would silence his critics for years. In October 1177, he assembled the largest army he had ever mobilized. The exact numbers are impossible to verify. Medieval chronicles always inflate them, but even by conservative estimates, we're talking about somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 combatants. An army with infantry, light cavalry, mounted archers, siege engineers, auxiliary troops, a war machine designed to meet no resistance. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Saladin would leave Egypt, march north, bypass the great Crusader fortresses on the coast, and head straight into the interior of the kingdom. If no one stopped him in open field, he could ravage and plunder the countryside before withdrawing, leaving the kingdom without the agricultural resources it needed to survive. Or, if the opportunity arose, attack Jerusalem directly. Baldwin was in Ascalon, the coastal city in the south of the kingdom, when word arrived that Saladin's army had crossed the border. The immediate problem was the scattering of Crusader forces. The Grand Master of the Temple, Odo of St. Amand, had ridden out with part of the Templar cavalry and clashed with Egyptian forces near Gaza. The result was disastrous. The Templars were ambushed, suffered heavy casualties, and Odo of St. Amand was taken prisoner, extremely rare for a Grand Master. He died in captivity the following year, refusing to be ransomed for a Muslim prisoner, because Templar rules forbade paying ransom for its members. That partial defeat left the Crusaders without part of their best cavalry at the worst possible moment. And Saladin, reading it as a sign that the road was clear, made the mistake that would change everything: he split his army. Splitting the army was, on paper, a tactically reasonable decision. With such overwhelming numbers, keeping the whole army together was logistically costly. Dividing it allowed more territory to be plundered, faster movement, panic sown in more places at once. The wing advancing north could rejoin the main body at an agreed point. On paper, it worked. What Saladin didn't account for was that Baldwin would come looking for him. Most commanders of that era, and many since, would have taken the defensive option. Retreat into Ascalon, withstand a siege, wait for reinforcements from Europe. It was the rational choice. It was the choice that saved Crusader lives in the short term. It was also the choice that would lose the kingdom in the medium term, because a systematic campaign of plunder with no resistance in open field would destroy the agricultural economy the entire feudal system depended on. Baldwin chose to ride out with roughly 450 knights, including surviving Templars, royal troops, and his personal guard, plus a smaller number of infantry. He left Ascalon carrying the relic of the true cross, the fragment of wood that, according to tradition, was part of the cross of Christ, and which the Crusader army always carried into battle as a symbol of spiritual and moral cohesion. For several days he tracked Saladin's army northward. This required intelligence in the true military sense of the word. Baldwin needed to know where the army was, which direction it was moving, how it was distributed. The Crusaders had a network of scouts and messengers that functioned with surprising efficiency. The local population, including Christian communities who had lived there for centuries, provided information. Castles on high ground had clear lines of sight over the main routes. Baldwin arrived at the field of Montgisard knowing exactly what he would find. And what he found was exactly what he needed: Saladin's army on the march, not in battle formation, its troops spread across a wide front, weighed down with plunder, its guard completely down, because no one expected a Crusader army capable of pursuing them. On November 25, 1177, on the plain near Montgisard, Baldwin ordered the charge. To understand what happened in the following minutes, you have to picture, in purely physical terms, what a medieval heavy cavalry charge actually is. A knight in full armor weighs between 100 and 120 kilograms with his equipment. The horse weighs between 500 and 700 kilograms, also partially armored. The lance measures nearly 4 meters. When that combination reaches charging speed, which can exceed 40 km per hour, the impact on unprepared infantry is something no written description can fully capture. 500 units of that impact struck the center of Saladin's army simultaneously. The Arab chronicles, and this detail matters, because they had no reason to exaggerate their own defeat, describe an immediate collapse. The Egyptian lines broke within minutes. Soldiers fled in every direction. Saladin's personal guard, his best men, were crushed before they could organize. Saladin himself escaped on horseback with a minimal escort. According to the Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing decades later with access to direct sources, Saladin fled in a state of total disorganization. Some versions say he reached Cairo riding a pack camel, having lost too many horses in the flight. Whether that's literal or metaphorical is hard to know, but the image captures something real: the most powerful man in the Islamic world fleeing through the desert with the Crusader army in pursuit. The pursuit was as intense and as long as the Crusader horses allowed. Kilometers of desert covered with the dead and abandoned equipment. The survivors of Saladin's army who made it back to Egypt arrived in disorganized groups, without equipment, without cohesion. The exact casualty figures are impossible to verify. Crusader chronicles always exaggerate upward. The Arab ones try to minimize. But that it was a catastrophic defeat is beyond dispute, because the political consequences it produced are documented and leave no room for interpretation. Saladin took months to reorganize his army. His internal rivals, the lords who had accepted him under pressure but never loved him, raised their heads. He had to spend time and political capital reasserting his authority within his own network of alliances. The machine he had spent years building to conquer Jerusalem had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, in terms of morale and operational capacity. And Baldwin returned to Jerusalem a hero. Bells rang in every church in the kingdom. The chronicles describe a celebration unlike any seen in decades. In Europe, the news arrived like a miracle. Literally, most who heard it took it as divine intervention. A leper king defeating the most powerful sultan in the world with a handful of knights was too extraordinary to be simply military tactics. But it was military tactics. Excellent military tactics, combined with precise intelligence, speed of decision-making, and a battlefield discipline the Crusaders had taken decades to develop. Here I want to pause on something that's almost never mentioned, and which I find one of the most fascinating aspects of this story. The Templars who charged at Montgisard represented something unique in the medieval world. They were, at the same time, monks and soldiers, two identities that, by 11th century logic, seemed contradictory, and that in practice created something completely different from any other military force of the era. The problem with feudal medieval cavalry was in discipline. Knights were men of honor, which meant their primary motivation in battle was individual. Personal glory, the capture of high-value prisoners for ransom, displays of bravery that raised their social status. Those motivations meant a typical feudal cavalry charge tended to spiral out of control. Knights chased their own individual targets, broke formation, and in many cases a partial victory turned into defeat because the army scattered in pursuit of its own successes. The Templars didn't work that way. Their monastic rule, which included precisely codified military discipline, literally forbade breaking formation without an order from the commander. A Templar who broke ranks on his own initiative during a charge could be expelled from the order. That rule, which sounded abstract on parchment, translated on the battlefield into 500 lances moving in the same direction at the same time, none of them straying. That is what hit the Egyptians at Montgisard, not brave individuals, but a machine. And now comes the consequence that's most often forgotten: Montgisard didn't save Jerusalem, it delayed its fall. That sounds defeatist, but it's the historical truth, and understanding it is key to understanding the scale of what Baldwin achieved in the years that followed, with a body disintegrating a little more every season. In 1179, 2 years after Montgisard, Saladin returned. The Battle of Montgisard was a Crusader defeat. Baldwin was there, fighting, and the chronicles say he nearly was captured. His horse was killed under him. He survived by the narrowest of margins. In 1180, Saladin destroyed the fortress of Jacob's Ford, which the Crusaders had spent months building on the Jordan as a forward outpost toward the north. It was strategically vital. Saladin besieged it, used engineers to mine the walls, and when the walls fell, what followed inside was brutal. Baldwin tried to reach it with a relief force and arrived too late. The fortress had already fallen. The survivors were executed or enslaved. Each of those defeats cost Baldwin not just territory or lives, it cost him political credibility. The nobles of the realm, who were already looking toward the succession, already speculating about who would rule after the king died, began making decisions based on that future instead of the present. The succession problem was, perhaps, Baldwin's second battle as exhausting as the military one. Baldwin could not marry. Leprosy made it practically and socially impossible. He could not have direct heirs. The heir would be the son of his sister Sibylla, and Sibylla's husband would hold enormous influence over the kingdom's future. The process of finding a suitable husband for Sibylla, of managing the ambitions of local nobles and knights newly arrived from Europe, of balancing the interests of the military orders, of keeping the Pope and the kings of Europe satisfied, consumed an enormous amount of political energy throughout Baldwin's life. The man who finally married Sibylla was Guy of Lusignan, a French noble who had come to the Holy Land with more ambition than ability. Baldwin despised him, and his reasons were well-founded. Guy repeatedly showed poor military judgment and a tendency toward impulsive action. Baldwin went so far as to remove him from the position of regent of the kingdom, which triggered an internal political crisis at a moment the kingdom could least afford one. But Baldwin could not annul the marriage without destroying his sister's position and destabilizing the succession even further. It was a perfect political trap, and he lived it while his disease advanced, his eyesight failed, and his hands grew less and less functional. In the last years of his life, Baldwin was nearly blind and had lost the use of his feet and hands. He ruled being carried on a litter, still made decisions, still called counsel, still remained the political center of gravity of a kingdom that would have collapsed without him long before it did. He died in the spring of 1185. He was 24 years old. William of Tyre, the chronicler who had known him since childhood, wrote about his death with an emotion that crosses 8 centuries without losing any of its weight. He writes that Baldwin died as he had lived, without complaint, with the same serenity he had shown since the age of 9. In July the day he learned what awaited him, Guy of Lusignan, by then king through his marriage to Sibylla, made the most catastrophic tactical decision of the entire Crusades. He led the full Crusader army, including the True Cross, into open field in July, in the height of summer in the Holy Land, on a march without enough water, toward the horns of Hattin. Saladin knew it, and waited. The Crusaders arrived dehydrated, disorganized, surrounded. Saladin set fire to the dry brush around them. The smoke combined with the summer heat. The Crusader army disintegrated. The True Cross was captured. Guy of Lusignan was taken prisoner. Within 3 months, Saladin had conquered most of the kingdom, including Jerusalem. What Baldwin had held together for 8 years with a broken body, a clear mind, and a will no medieval physician could explain, fell in 3 months once he was no longer there. And here is the question I find hardest to answer, and which I think is worth asking. What would have happened if Baldwin had lived 10 more years? It's counterfactual, I know. History doesn't run on hypotheticals. But the question has grounding, because the kingdom's collapse after his death was not inevitable, it was the result of specific decisions made by specific people, decisions Baldwin would have prevented. The decision at Hattin, made by Guy of Lusignan, was exactly the kind of impulsive move Baldwin had spent years reigning in. With Baldwin alive, Guy would never have had the power to make it. The kingdom founded in 1099, which survived 88 years amid constant hostility and produced one of the most extraordinary figures in medieval history, ended in 1187. A third crusade led by Richard the Lionheart recovered part of the coast, but never regained Jerusalem. Montgisard remained the peak, the moment when everything seemed possible. The moment a teenager, his body collapsing from within, rode into the desert with 500 knights and told the most powerful man in the world that this day would not go his way. And there's one more thing I want you to take from this story, something beyond the military epic. Baldwin IV lived in an age that had a clear, brutal answer for someone in his situation: withdraw. Leprosy was a sign of impurity, of a curse, of something medieval society wanted nowhere near it. The expected response was the monastery, seclusion, invisibility, in many cases, active exclusion. Baldwin rejected that response every single day of his life for 8 years, not with speeches, not with proclamations, simply by being the king he was supposed to be, with what he had, under the conditions he had. That is Montgisard in its fullest sense. Not just a battle won on the plain of Ranelagh on November 25, 1177. It is proof that external circumstances, even the harshest ones, even those that attack the body itself, do not determine what a person chooses to do with the time they have. Saladin understood this in his own way. After Montgisard, he never again underestimated the Crusader kingdom while Baldwin lived. He waited, he was patient, he tested the edges, he won smaller battles, but he did not attempt the final blow until Baldwin was no longer there. The leper boy of 16 gave Saladin 8 years of caution. On the scale of medieval history, that is an eternity. And on November 25, when the son of the Levant beat down on the plain of Montgisard, and 500 Crusader lances struck the most powerful army in the world, Baldwin IV won the battle no one believed he could win. With hands that could no longer close into fists, with eyes already beginning to fail, at 16 years old, and with more character than every healthy king who came before or after him.